It was a cold winter's evening in London, a thick fog hanging over the city streets like a heavy veil. The usual hustle of the city had slowed, the darkness spreading its tendrils over the cobblestone roads as the lanterns flickered dimly in the distance. Sherlock Holmes, London's most renowned detective, stood in the dimly lit sitting room of his Baker Street apartment, his piercing gaze fixed on the fire crackling in the hearth. His mind was sharp as ever, methodically piecing together the puzzle of a complex case involving a missing diplomat and a stolen letter. But there was something different about him that night. His usual composure was replaced by an unsettling air of distraction. Dr. John Watson, his ever-loyal companion, sat at the desk nearby, his pen poised over a sheet of paper. The silence between the two was heavy, both of them caught in their own thoughts when Watson finally broke the quiet. "Sherlock, you seem distant tonight. Is something wrong?" Sherlock turned to face his friend, his sharp features softened by a rare, fleeting expression of vulnerability. He hesitated, a subtle flicker of hesitation in his usually confident eyes. "There's something I must tell you, Watson," he began, his voice low, almost strained. "Something I've never spoken of to anyone." Watson raised an eyebrow. Sherlock Holmes, a man of unshakable resolve, had always been an enigma to him, but now the detective seemed different, almost human. "What is it, Holmes? You've never been one to hide your thoughts." Sherlock paced slowly across the room as though struggling to find the words. Finally he stopped, his back turned to Watson. "It's about a case that to this day remains unsolved, and more importantly, a decision I made, a lie that I've carried with me for years." He paused, his voice becoming more solemn. "It's the only time I've ever lied, Watson." Watson's curiosity was piqued. Sherlock Holmes, the master of logic and truth, had lied? It was almost inconceivable. "What are you saying, Holmes?" Sherlock's voice dropped even lower, almost as if he were confessing to a crime. "It was many years ago when I was just starting out as a detective. I was hired to investigate the mysterious death of a man named Victor Holloway, a renowned philanthropist in London's high society. His death was deemed a suicide, but there were inconsistencies. I was hired by his widow, a woman named Clara Holloway, to uncover the truth." Watson leaned forward, sensing that Sherlock was about to reveal something monumental. "And what did you find?" Sherlock turned, his face now clouded with regret. "I discovered that it wasn't a suicide. Holloway was murdered, strangled, in his own home. But there was one problem. The evidence, the physical evidence, pointed to Clara Holloway herself. A woman with no criminal history, no motive, and no history of violence. She was innocent, Watson. She couldn't have done it." Watson was stunned, trying to piece the puzzle together. "So, what did you do?" Sherlock closed his eyes for a moment, as though reliving the memory. "I lied. I fabricated evidence to exonerate her. I told the police that the cause of death was inconclusive. I created false reports, made sure she was cleared of any wrongdoing. But why? Why did I do it? It wasn't justice, Watson. It was mercy." A silence hung in the room as Watson processed this revelation. "But you didn't think the truth should come out? Didn't she deserve to be held accountable?" Sherlock sighed deeply. "I couldn't bring myself to expose her. She had been broken by the loss of her husband, and I saw the truth in her eyes. She wasn't capable of murder. But I made a choice that day, Watson. I chose to protect her, to let the world believe she was innocent, even if it meant dishonoring the very thing I've dedicated my life to: truth." Watson felt a deep sympathy for his friend, a man who had always prided himself on his unyielding commitment to justice. He had never seen Sherlock so torn, so vulnerable. "You've carried this burden all these years, haven't you?" Sherlock nodded slowly, the weight of his own secret pressing down on him. "Every day, and now, it haunts me." Days passed, and Sherlock Holmes seemed to carry the weight of his confession with him. His usual sharpness was dulled, his mind clouded by the burden of the lie he had told so many years ago. Watson, ever the loyal friend, tried to offer solace, but it was clear that Sherlock was a man deeply conflicted. struggling with the consequences of his actions. It wasn't long before the past came knocking on their door. One evening, as Sherlock sat in his study, a knock came at the door. Watson, ever watchful, opened it to reveal a young man in his late 20s. His face was pale, his eyes filled with a sense of urgency. "Is this the home of Sherlock Holmes?" the man asked, his voice trembling. "I am he," Sherlock replied, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. Dr. John Watson, now a man weighed down by the loss of his friend, spent countless nights in their Baker Street apartment, rereading old cases, searching for clues, hoping that somehow, somewhere, there was a hint that would bring Sherlock back. But there was nothing. No letters, no messages, no signs of life. It was as though Holmes had walked into the depths of the unknown and never returned. The public assumed the worst. The police were baffled, and despite their best efforts, they could find no leads. Sherlock Holmes, the greatest detective the world had ever known, had seemingly been outsmarted by a criminal genius far beyond even his capacity to understand. The news of his disappearance sent ripples throughout the criminal underworld, many of whom had feared him for years. And yet, even they were unable to decipher the final act of the man who had spent his life solving their most complicated schemes. Weeks turned into months and the case went cold. Watson, now alone in his grief, felt the heavy weight of abandonment. His life had been intertwined with Holmes's for so long that it felt impossible to imagine the world without his friend's keen mind and sharp wit by his side. Watson continued to write, to search, to try and piece together any shred of information that could lead him to Holmes. But every lead he followed ended in frustration, and every dead end deepened the mystery of Holmes's disappearance. One evening, while Watson sat at his desk staring at the final case Holmes had been working on, the one that led to his disappearance, he noticed something that had escaped his attention before. A small, nearly invisible symbol on the corner of a page. It was a cryptic mark, something Holmes had left behind deliberately, perhaps as a final clue. Watson's heart raced as he realized that Sherlock had not given up. He had left a message, hidden within the very case he had been chasing. With renewed determination, Watson began to unravel the meaning behind the symbol. Piece by piece, he put together the fragmented clues that Sherlock had left for him. The symbols, the oddities. In the case, they all pointed to one final location, the warehouse near the docks. But as Watson made his way there, a deep sense of foreboding began to settle over him. He could feel the presence of something far greater than a mere case. He was walking into the heart of a conspiracy that had consumed his friend, a game that Holmes had been unwilling or perhaps unable to escape. Watson arrived at the warehouse, his pulse quickening as he stepped inside. The place was dark and abandoned, the air thick with the scent of old wood and decay. He moved cautiously, his hand on the revolver tucked inside his coat, just in case. As he reached the back of the warehouse, the shadows shifted, and there, standing in the dim light, was a figure. It was Holmes. But not the Holmes Watson had known. His once sharp, confident demeanor had been replaced by a hollow, broken version of the man he had once called his closest friend. Sherlock Holmes had been defeated. The criminal mastermind who had been the cause of Holmes's disappearance had left him a mere shell of the man he once was. "I knew you'd come, Watson." Sherlock's voice was low, almost unreadable. "Sherlock, what happened?" Watson asked, his heart sinking. "It's over," Holmes whispered, his eyes distant. "I have nothing left, Watson. The case, it consumed me." Holmes had vanished not because of the danger, but because of the toll the case had taken on him. The man who had once been a genius, unbeatable and unshakable, had been defeated not by the criminal but by the burden of his own mind. The darkness of the case had torn him apart from within, and now Watson understood. Sherlock Holmes had vanished forever, not because of a crime, but because of the weight of the truth that he had been forced to face in the final hours of his life.